This is going to be another guitar-focused theory video. In the last one, we talked about whole tone clusters and how we put them together to make major scales. And more specifically, how do we apply that to the guitar? If we can connect these two things, theory and the fretboard, then both aspects reinforce each other. It grounds and amplifies our theory knowledge because we are guitar players, and it fortifies our familiarity with the fretboard itself. And eventually, they shouldn't actually be separate at all. To know one is to know the other. How we did this is by learning the different shapes that whole tone clusters can take on the fretboard. And we saw this kind of pattern emerge. 3 on the lower string, 2 and 2, 3 on the higher string, and then across 3 strings with 2 in the middle. Because the guitar gives you multiple ways to play any given thing, it often feels daunting as a beginner that you might have to learn all of them. So anytime you can sort of reduce or simplify your understanding in this way can be really helpful. So this time I want to do something similar, except instead of talking about whole tone clusters, we'll talk about diminished. Alright, so let's talk about diminished. There are only 3 of them, and if you've seen my diminished series, then you're probably familiar with the terms earth, wind, and fire, which are just labels that I use to call the diminished chords by. So you should probably go watch that diminished elements video if you haven't seen it already, because that's how I'm going to be referring to the diminished chords later on. But first, let's check out some shapes on the guitar. Okay, let's start by grabbing a note on the low E string. How about this B flat right here? Now, we're going to try to go through all the shapes that we can think of and see what kind of pattern we get. So, firstly, I guess we could do notes across all strings, or 1 note per string, but that's really impractical unless you have super large hands. You're not going to be using that a whole lot. Okay, now let's do an arpeggio using only 2 strings, and we'll find that we have 2 notes on each string. Now let's keep the same starting note, that B flat, but we're going to use 3 strings, and we're going to have 2 notes on the lower string. So that will look like this. Now, again, let's keep the same note, but we're going to put the string that has 2 notes in the middle. So it'll still be using 3 strings, but now we have 2 notes on that middle string. Okay, let's do 1 more, but we're going to put the 2 notes on the upper string, so like this. So we can see that we have sort of a similar pattern going on to what we talked about in that whole tone pieces video. We have a shape that has only 2 strings, and there's 2 notes on each of those strings. But most of the shapes that we have are actually using 3 strings, and we have this pattern where one of the strings has 2 notes on it, 2 notes of the arpeggio. So that is like this: 2 on the bottom, 2 in the middle, and then 2 on the top. Now that same pattern is also going to apply to the next string over. So if we start on the A string somewhere, like maybe, how about this F right here? So we have only using 2 strings. Now across 3 strings, 2 on the bottom. Now how about our 2 in the middle? So I've got my 2 notes on this middle string. And now the last shape, I have 2 notes on the top string. The next string over is where it starts to get a little wonky, because we have this string pair with a major third involved. So the shapes look a little bit different, but it's still the same concept. So let's check it out. Let's start on this A. So we'll do the shape that uses 2 strings. That's the same. Nothing is different there. But now this shape that uses 3 strings, it looks a little different, right? And it's actually a little easier because you don't have to stretch as far. But it looks a little bit different because we're using the G and B string now. Okay, let's go to the next one that has 2 in the middle. And now with 2 on our upper string. Okay, let's shift up yet another string, and this time we'll start on D. So we have our shape that uses 2 strings. In this one, we have to kind of position switch a little bit more. It's not, we don't get a diminished if we do that same shape. We have to kind of shift our finger up an extra fret because, again, we have this major third. But the concept is still the same. You can see how each of the strings has 2 notes on it. Okay, now let's do across 3 strings with 2 on the lower string. And now let's do 2 in the middle. And now 2 on the upper string. Something that's kind of interesting that you can mess around with is playing the diminished arpeggios just chromatically. Except you're going to designate or assign each element its own finger pattern. So every time you play a specific element, it's going to have the same fingering pattern. Let me show you what I mean. So if I start with earth, I'm just going to give earth the fingering pattern that has 2 notes on the bottom string. Then for the next element, wind, I'm going to have my 2 notes in the middle string. And then for fire, my 2 notes are on the top string. The next element is earth again. And guess what? My 2 notes are on the bottom, the same way we started. So if I cycle through those 3 fingering patterns, 2 on the bottom, 2 in the middle, 2 on the top, then each element will have its own sort of fingering pattern, and that might look something like this. Okay, and now I want to talk about what we have on screen here, which is all of the shapes that we just went over, but you know, they're laid out in front of us. And it's kind of nice to just see them all here because we have 11 shapes total, but if we look at how they're laid out in a second, it really just boils down to like 4 patterns, which is what we talked about earlier, you know, using 2 strings, using 3 strings, but with 2 notes on a certain string, etc. So seeing it all laid out here maybe kind of makes tackling these diminished shapes feel more manageable. So let's go through them really quick one more time. Here, this top one, we have this shape. And we can play that in a couple different spots. We can play it on that string, that string. And the only place where we use this shape is on the G and B strings. So that's why in this column you actually see there's a missing spot here because there's not another shape that kind of has this pattern with 2 strings but 2 notes on each string. We don't have a third shape. So let's go over to the next column. We can do diminished like this. That's this top one. And we can use that same shape, the next string set over. And then if we move over again, we get that middle shape. And then moving to the top 4 strings, it's the bottom. Okay, next column over again, we have our 2 notes in the middle now. And just moving a string set over, same shape. If we move over one more time, we're going to get that middle shape. And then the top 3 strings. Okay, now let's do this last pattern, the last column, starting with the top shape that has our 2 notes on the highest string. And we can move that over a string set. Now doing our middle shape. and then that bottom shape for the highest 3 strings. So this is just kind of helpful for me to see them laid out like this because I can sort of follow the pattern. 2 strings, using 2 strings, and 2 on each. Using 3 strings, these are all using 3 strings. But here we have our 2 notes on 1 string. For this one, the 2 notes are in the middle, and then over here, the 2 notes on the upper string. And then looking down, these other ones are just variations of these. So that's really helpful for me to think about them that way, and it kind of helps me to understand how diminished works on the actual fretboard. Okay, what we're looking at right now is probably incomprehensible, but just to explain really quickly, this is all of the notes on the fretboard labeled with what element they are. So if I was to zoom in, say right here, this note, this is the note A, and we can see in the vicinity some other earth notes. So we have C right here, we have E flat, and F sharp. This is still probably incomprehensible, but this is a shape we just learned about. And having learned those shapes, maybe this is a little bit more recognizable, like your eye can pick it out. But let's scale it back. Like this is maybe a little too complicated, so let's just isolate one element. All right, so now I have my individual elements isolated, and I'm going to talk about earth here still. So if I zoom in, you can see I sort of connected the dots with this little arpeggio shape. So let me play that real quick. Okay, so if I have a structure that's easier for my brain to focus on, like zoom in on, maybe it's not so incomprehensible. I don't know. But if we look at this little arpeggio shape, the notes that are connected with these green lines, we can see some shapes that we just talked about, like this one here. Or these top 4 notes, boom, 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 like that. We can recognize that shape from what we talked about earlier. And same with these 4 notes right here. And the next 4 notes. Okay, real quick, let's just do, let's look at wind here. Let's start on this D flat. We mostly have this little zigzagging pattern, but then starting at this note and going up the top 3 strings, we have this shape. And if we actually zoom in, there's some other stuff that we can see. Check this out. Right here, these little 4 notes make the diminished shape that we learned on the top 4 strings. So if you can start to see some of these patterns, then maybe learning these different diminished and their elements all over the fretboard will be a bit more manageable. Okay, so on that note, taking another look at the fretboard entirely labeled with elemental symbols, maybe it's a little bit more comprehensible. You know, at first it's just going to be way too much to make sense of. It's just like visual noise that isn't really helpful. But after spending time with some of these shapes and getting familiar with these structures, whether it's a small 4-note structure or a larger arpeggio like what we talked about before, then this will be a little bit easier for your mind's eye to make sense of. And that's kind of how the guitar works in general. You know, when you're a beginner, the guitar kind of looks like this chart. There's too much going on. It's hard for your brain to make sense of because there's a lot of strings, there's a lot of frets, and there's a lot of notes. Maybe there's a couple visual landmarks because you have inlays, but it's overwhelming. But as you familiarize yourself with more structures on the guitar, you start to map out pathways and little areas on the fretboard, and slowly you kind of understand how the fretboard works. And what's cool about diminished is that if you are familiar with these diminished shapes, and if you are familiar with the elements, you know what notes are in earth, you know the fire notes, you know what notes are in wind, then if I take this shape and I even know just one of the notes in this shape, like this B on the top string, well, I know that B is fire. So let's say this note, this bottom note, maybe I don't know what it is, but already just by knowing the fact that it has to be a fire note because it's in this diminished shape, well, that cuts down the guesswork a lot because it can only be one of 3 notes. So if I had to try and sum up what I'm getting at in this video, I will do it with an example. Let's take this note C on the top string and let's look at this chord shape. Now, do I know this chord shape because I know the notes in it? C, E, G, C. Or do I know the notes because I know the chord shape? Like, do I know this C because I know this chord shape that's sort of like rooted on this high C note? Well, the answer is really both. I can't fully know this chord and understand this chord unless I know the notes inside of it, have some understanding of the pieces. But vice versa, if you tell me this note is C and I have no context to anchor it to, then my familiarity with this one single note is going to be very weak. I know that this is a C because it's in this chord, and it's in this chord, and it's in this chord, and it's also in this chord. You know, I have a lot of contexts within which this note exists. I've played a lot of music where I'm using this note and I kind of see that existing in a context. Whether it's a chord, like, or a scale, you know? And the same is true of these diminished shapes and knowing our elements. They can help us learn our notes all over the fretboard if that's something we don't know yet. But also using our familiarity with different structures like diminished chords, other scales, and so on, to give context to the guitar and slowly fill in the fretboard with specific pitches, it'll help us learn these structures more deeply. And then maybe we can hopefully use them with more competence, confidence, and creativity. Okay, I think we can probably call it a day there. I hope you're enjoying these discussions of how we can take our knowledge of theory and apply it specifically to the fretboard. Yeah, I hope you're getting something out of it. I know I am. And if you do find this helpful or interesting, like the video, leave me your comments and thoughts down below, subscribe, share this with somebody, and you can also feel free to show extra support by donating to me on Ko-fi. All right, everybody, I will see you in the next one.